It's great. Welcome back. The Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. It is still the 23rd of January. And now we're going to pivot to even more data. Our heads were exploding after Patrick's incredible and useful updates on demographics and incomes and departures and arrivals. We're now going to pivot to the Department of Labor and their secret weapon, which is Matt Barowitz, who is I can never remember your title, Matt. You are the Economic and Labor Market Information Director at the Department of Labor, and we welcome you. It's good to see you. This is our first time with you this session. We welcome you back, and you are a font of information, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Senator. For the record, my name is Matthew Barowitz. I am the Director of the Economic and Labor Market Information Division with the Vermont Department of Labor. I appreciate you all having me here today. I did send over a slide deck to Heidi late last night that hopefully is at your availability. I will screen share in just a moment. The good news is, oops.
We have it in front of us.
Great. The good news is some of my coworkers at the Vermont Department of Labor have been in front of this committee already and took some notes on some questions that you had for me. And that actually gave me a nice framework to kind of put together a slide deck that I'll go through based on those questions. Should something be of no interest to you, give me the move it ahead sign, because I put this together based on the questions I received from our policy liaison, Rowan Hawthorne. So we will get into it right now. And the slide deck should be coming up. Here we are, January 2025, if you can believe it. So just a little quick background and housekeeping for myself. As I said, I'm the Director of the Economic and Labor Market Information Division for the Vermont Department of Labor. There's one of our little shops in every state in the nation, including Guam, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and Washington, D.C. Together, these 54 states and territories form the National Labor Data Systems. We are predominantly funded by the U.S. Department of Labor, specifically the Bureau of Labor Statistics, to collect, compile, and release economic data on the Vermont economy, consistent with federal methodology. So when we're talking about the unemployment rate here in the state of Vermont, it is consistent with the definitions and methodology used in the state of California. We're using standard definitions for terms like manufacturing, for nurses. Up and down the line, we use our federal partners' definitions, methodologies, and tools to collect and compile this research and data so that it is comparable. We do get additional funds from the Employment and Training Administration, which gives us a little bit more flexibility in our day-to-day work, including having a website, doing occupational projections, and doing special projects, internships, and presentations. And that is why they get a thank you for supporting our work. So I can be here today to talk about our information and help explain the economic data we do have. So we're going to talk about this data, and I was able to, through the joys of technology, hear some of the conversations you had this morning. I'm certainly not trying to pile on to any swimming heads that are going on right now. I'm hoping that I can be the linkages in some concepts that have been discussed either today or previously in your committee. And let's see. So one of the questions that was... Yes. Hello?
We're having a feedback issue. Or something issue. Anyway, given that you can't see us while the screen is up necessarily, if people have questions, I'll just try and interrupt and we'll. Are you okay with us asking questions as we move along?
Please, that is preferred.
So it's a little awkward because you can't necessarily see us, but we'll try and intervene as quickly as we can with questions.
That's great, and I'll be really active in toggling between. So I will look for hand signals and any sort of noises. So I was asked to just kind of give a quick overview of our BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics programs, and how this data, what this data is and how it's used. So it's kind of a nice discussion point here. So the first and core function of our division is the quarterly census of employment and wages. Back in the 1930s, when unemployment insurance laws were created and handed to the states to administer, the quarterly census of employment and wages was allowed to begin, because what happens is by law, any employer in the state of Vermont, using federal definitions or state definitions for employer with an employee, is required to register with the Vermont Department of Labor. And so in the administration of unemployment insurance, we collect a wealth of information about employers, and it is a census. Notice the C word in here. It is a census, meaning that everyone is required to talk to us. So this information is extremely comprehensive. It is not very timely because we are collecting and compiling data for over 30,000 employers, but it is very accurate. It is the bedrock of all our data systems that are built. So as an example, and I do say this is not time series because that is the federal definition, and I'll just give you a quick example of why it's not time series. You're not supposed to compare it over time because, say, for example, a Vermont employer comes up with a product, they start building it here in Vermont and start a manufacturing operation. Well, it goes so well, the next year they decide to move their manufacturing operations and turn their previous manufacturing operations into a massive headquarters. They can then be reclassified from the industry activity of manufacturing to administrative offices and services. And so what happens in a time series is it can look like, there's a tremendous amount of job gains and job losses. And what it is really a reclassification of the business activity. But it is a tremendous asset, this data, when we're talking about top line numbers, because we're just talking about how many businesses we have in the state of Vermont. For establishments, over 31,000, and this has been growing tremendously since the pandemic. And this is a conversation I know this committee has been interested in, or it's come up, is remote workers and remote work. The reason we're seeing a 3 times, 4 times growth in the number of establishments is that anytime an employee or a worker gets a job for a company that doesn't have a presence in Vermont, that company has to register for the state of Vermont, even if you're a remote worker. So if you're a California company and you hire a Vermonter to have a remote work job, that company has to register with Vermont Department of Labor. We now have one firm, one employee, or as we saw in the pandemic, some people moved here with their jobs. And again, their employer had to register with us, one firm, one employee. So we see a lot of that. And so even that nearly 5% growth rate, which is very large, is much larger than our employment growth rate of about 2%, which is quite strong and consistent with Cavett and Carr's assessment of our economy right now, that it is growing at a pretty good clip. But these establishments that we're adding are quite small and they're quite specialized, indicating that they are remote workers. Unfortunately, the Vermont Department of Labor doesn't have like some sort of flag in our system where we can say, this is a remote worker, this isn't. But when you squint at the data really carefully and you see a bunch of one-person shops doing, say, network administration or managerial consulting, these type of occupations that pop up that are typically conducive to remote work, you kind of make the assumption. And sometimes you can even study down to the local address and see it looks like more like a residential address than it is like a commercial address.
So Matt, I just make a sort of a question and observation. As we look at more companies and the federal government perhaps pivoting to more in-person work, and away from remote work or fewer days remote, this may have a significant impact on these numbers.
It could. Particularly in the employment account. Unfortunately, employers are typically pretty good about registering with us. They're not typically good about shutting down registration. So we'll still have this large establishment count, so potentially a lot of them with zeros in it, with no employees, I mean. So yes, right. That's a fair point, Senator.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And again, from top line information, we're going to dive a little deeper in this. The quarterly census of employment and wages gives us a good average wage, and this is realized wages paid to Vermonters. The 2023 calculation was $61,813, up 3.7% over 2022. Historically speaking, you'd say 3.7% increase in wages is very strong. We're normally looking at like 3%, 2.5% for historical. But as we know, inflation has been very high and wages tend to be a little lagged. So even with inflation right now at 2.9%, wages are still catching up. But in the recent years, inflation has been higher than wage growth. So again, that catch up, what they call sticky wages associated with prices. So just again, some top line numbers here from QCW about how the state of the Vermont economy is looking. This information can also get detailed down into industries, which we talked a little bit about in the introduction here. But if you just look at, again, I'm just providing basic summaries based on the questions I received in advance. 306,971 covered jobs, meaning it's covered by unemployment insurance. There's an employee-employer relationship, and therefore they're required to talk to the Vermont Department of Labor. Of that total, about 83% is in the private sector. And when you look at the largest private sectors by employment, this is sectors meaning at the 2-digit industrial classification level. These are big groupings: healthcare, social assistance, retail, trade, accommodation, and food service and manufacturing. Those are the 4 biggest sectors in the Vermont economy as it's measured by employment. And if you take a look at these 4, that represents 47% of the entire Vermont economy's employment opportunities. So we're talking about half of all jobs are found in these 4 industries. Sectors. Even I get tripped up on this language sometimes and how I use it. One other thing that people find interesting about the quarterly census of employment and wages is it allows us to break firms down by firm size. And so this is a big chart, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of numbers to illustrate how it works. And if you wanted me to take a deeper dive into this conversation, I'd be happy to at a future time. But you can see this is private firms only. And so we're about 29,000 firms registered with the Vermont Department of Labor as private entities. Of those 29,000, approximately 21,000 have 4 or fewer workers. That accounts for nearly 75% of all firms in the state of Vermont. Even though that is a large number as a percentage of firms, it only represents 10% of the employment because they are small employers. Conversely, if you go to the far end of the scale, there's 15 firms registered in the state of Vermont with 1,000 or more workers. Even though that represents only 0.1% of all private firms, they account for 12% of the employment opportunities in the state of Vermont. So a lot of times I've seen public policy conversations talk about, for firms, if employers have less than 10 employees or less than 50 employees, and this can be helpful to understand how much of those type of conversations would impact private firms. And so I'll just pause there because we're going to switch programs. Quarterly census of employment and wages, our bedrock. This is our biggest program, where it is about 5-month flags. And that's why when I say it's not timely, it's difficult to base public policy on something with a 5-month flag, but it is extremely accurate and comprehensive, which gives it its strength. And it also becomes the universe for which we develop all our surveys from. So this is our universe, which we build samples from. And one of the programs that's a sample-based program, current employment statistics. This is similar to QCW in that it is measuring industry employment, but it is done much faster and much less accurate because it is just a sample. It's not a census. We don't talk to everyone. We only talk to about 1,600 businesses or so, but it does come out with a month-to-month lag. So when you see the Vermont Department of Labor release their monthly jobs report, as it's sometimes referred to, the current employment statistics is highlighted in it. Here is just a graph kind of showing how from November 2022 to November 2024, you can see the general trend line of not only the seasonally adjusted, but the unadjusted data. And we have a lot of seasonality in our economy. And so the seasonal adjustment factors help kind of give us a smoother trend line. You'll notice that red line is a little smoother and showing, for the most part, a general trend upwards. The last couple of months here, we're getting towards the end of the calendar year when CES is doing its work. Every year after we complete our 12-month cycle, we re-benchmark all that data to the quarterly census of employment and wages, basically the answer, right? The quarterly census of employment and wages, once we compile all that information from employers, is exactly what the Vermont economy is. CES is trying to estimate that on a month-to-month basis. So after a year's worth of collection, we can true up the current employment statistics and then start new estimates for 12 more months. So towards the end of the line, it gets a little wonkier. So we're at this point waiting to close the books on 2024 and re-estimate 2024 so we can begin 2025 estimation. just from a sectors breakdown and where growth is coming from, I'll just put them all out there and we can talk about them. So I can also read your facial cues if you have questions. Where we're seeing growth in employment, again, I'm focused on employment. I'm with the Department of Labor, so I'm not focused on profitability or any sort of revenue conversations. But as it relates to employment, where we're seeing growth is the big three of tourism, specifically accommodation and food services. That's number one. Number two, arts, entertainment, and recreation. And number three, retail trade. So those three have shown employment growth over the last 12 to 18 months. Some of that is recovery from the COVID pandemic, where many of those industries were dramatically impacted. Retail is starting to maybe stabilize. Technology has really taken its hits at retail over the last few years, but we have seen growth back in retail recently. So that's a development. The other three on this list, professional and technical services, this is what we're talking about when we talk about a lot of the remote workers here. This is these are business-to-business services, people doing consulting, it runs the gamut, really. It could be anything from economists to accountants to architects to engineers to management consultants, website design, a lot of different professionals in there. And I know I've been in front of this committee before talking about this. It's basically specialization 2.0, the way the American economy has grown and thrived for decades, going back to Henry Ford's specialization 1.0, where he revolutionized the way manufacturing was done. So now it's just we're specializing differently, more technical services. These are small firms that typically do business-to-business relationships. I use the example of, should I decide to go in private practice as an economist, I don't want to build my own website. I don't want to do payroll. I don't want to do HR. I don't want to do my legal contracts. I hire another small company that specializes in those. I'll hire them for promotion and marketing, and they will handle those type of things. It allows me to focus on what I do best. Hopefully, in your eyes, you agree, which is economics, and that would make the business grow. I would find somebody else whose specialty is something else and partner with them to help make my business grow, while I could focus on the actual core function. So professional and technical services, those are those jobs that a lot of times can be done anywhere, assuming good connectivity. Healthcare and social assistance. Oh, question.
It can wait till the end. It's for me understanding how soon we might know any drastic change in any of these because of anything, but maybe a federal policy changing. I think we're going to have to be watching certain sectors and trying to get beyond anecdotal. And I wonder how soon you can help us look at things like that.
Which goes to what we chatted about earlier about in terms of the trend federally and the private sector, and more people coming to work and fewer remote, as they begin to rein in remote
Yes.
beds and private sector increasing
Oh, yeah.
more and more people. Our growth is heavily, both from Patrick's
Right.
presentation and this, heavily dependent on people being able to work remotely.
Right. I was thinking too about immigration policy and things that might create like a blip that we should understand.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Senator. I appreciate the question. I'm flagging it for further research to see what type of information and how we could derive it. My first thoughts is that it would come from that first program. We talked about the quarterly census of employment and wages, which does have about a 5-month lag. So the first indications we could start seeing is getting more zero reporters from employers, like people either not filing or actually providing zero. If we saw an uptick in that, perhaps we would start seeing, from our standpoint, the first indications of a change in direction on that.
Thank you.
No problem.
If you could be telling us about those.
Healthcare and social assistance, many people separate those two, but as it works is in terms of the sector classifications, they do get lumped together. I do have information that could break them down further, but for the sake of time and speed, I'm just going to move forward. And should we want to talk about that more specifically, we could take a deeper dive. And lastly, government. Of the three branches of government, growth has been seen in the federal government, less so, but then local and then state. And education is a part of that, both local education and state education. But some of the growth, or a good chunk of the growth we're actually seeing at the state, is in public administration. So what you would think of as state employees.
So growth in state employees.
Yes, specifically state employment. Yes. Yep.
Right.
All right. Let's see. Okay. Oh, and as a quick note, will say the trends are pretty clear that there is one industry that has been going down as an employment base, and that is specifically related to durable goods manufacturing, not to be confused with non-durable good manufacturing, which we do have a tremendous amount of. When thinking of non-durables, you could think about beers, cheese, wine, chocolate, ice cream. Any of those consumable goods that we produce here. That has shown some steadiness in employment, but durable manufacturing has been declining over the last year or so. It is a long-term trend, not to say that these industries aren't still critically important to our local employment base and that they're not productive. They do generate wealth and profit, but it's just, as an employment base, they have been decreasing. They're using technology different, they're hiring people with different skills, and they're able to leverage those skills and the technology to produce more. All right, next program, OEWS, the Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics program. It's annual data on wages by occupation. And this is just an example. We produce data on 600 occupations. We produce at the statewide level and also 3 sub-state areas. You have the Burlington labor market area or metropolitan area, and then you have the balance of the state to the north and the balance of the state to the south. It gives valuable information on the wage distribution, not just the average or the median, but the 10th, the 25th, the 75th, and the 90th percentile. This information is used by job seekers and employers to understand pay structures for maybe an entry-level position or an experience-level position that they might be recruiting for. Here's an example of licensed nursing assistants and the wages that we have for them in 2023. And you can see a nice range in terms of if you're starting out, what you could expect to make versus as you gained experience in this position.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
Can I just ask a question on this? If our average age is 61,000 or 62, or in the low 60s, it's only 10% of our population earning more than $80,000. Is that correct? The way to read it?
This is for L&A.
This is specifically for one occupation.
Sorry.
Yep.
I'm on the 600. I was starting. Right. Okay. This is for licensed nurse LNA.
Yeah, licensed nursing assistants. Yep. So this,
right.
Yeah, a sample of the data that we produce, and again, we do it for over 600 occupations. Yep.
Right.
This data, ultimately, we use it in one of our most successful partnerships with the McClure Foundation, now working together for over a decade. This is the 6th version of this. We're trying to create awareness about the opportunities in the state of Vermont, this wage data, as well as our occupational forecasts, which we'll talk about in just a moment, get highlighted in this brochure. So this is one of the ways this data gets used.
And Matt, how much longer are we able to benefit from the McClure Foundation grant that we got?
It's not a grant, it is a partnership. And so we've continued to, every year or so, we'll check in to see if we're going to do it again in the next year, because this happens every 2 years. And thus far, we've been given positive signs that we see this partnership continuing.
Right.
Yep.
And how many states do they partner with?
Just us. I think it's just us.
Oh, that's great. I mean, so we had to apply for it. So I guess I'm mixing up grant and we had. I remember when we applied for it and got it, and it's exciting that we have this partnership because they're a huge.
I would have to clarify with the McClure Foundation, but there's no application process for this. This is just a partnership. They came to us initially 10 years ago and said, you know, you have great data, but it's really ugly. We think we can produce it in a better, more easily to use format. We agreed to partner with them. We provide the data, the analytics, and they provide the production in the design. And then as of lately, we've been doing more of a cost sharing where the Department of Labor has been using these so much more that we actually started pitching in on the printing It does. It is a mutual partnership, and they still continue to see value as one of their key beliefs is that no good job in Vermont should go unfilled due to lack of qualified applicant. So I believe production is, I think, 80,000. I think every school in Vermont has gotten one of these, and we continue to promote them in a variety of areas so that people are aware.
It's great, and we got this pamphlet last week, and it's terrific.
I used it with my daughter as a senior in high school, but is this new? Have we not done this prior to this year?
This is version number 6, so we've been doing it for about a decade. We do it every 2 years. You get a new one.
Version number 6. Okay.
Yep. All right. Lastly, and this is where I know some of the follow-up questions were definitely from, related to the local area unemployment statistics program. So I kind of put some of the more busybody stuff at the front so we could dive into this. This is, again, a Bureau of Labor Statistics program. It is done in partnership with the U.S. Census Bureau, and it does produce monthly estimates on the Vermont labor force, the unemployment rate, number of unemployed people, number of employed people. And it is key to understand that the U.S. Census Bureau is actually doing the data collection through the current population survey. They take the data and they do produce and release current population survey data. And I'll make this distinction again if it's not clear later, but the current population survey data ultimately comes to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts it in their own statistical models that we manage and partner with them on, and to produce Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates. So you will see estimates of the unemployment rate coming out of the U.S. Census Bureau and the current population survey, but they're not the quote the official unemployment rate because it hasn't been gone through the Bureau of Labor Statistics process. That is a narrow process, so there's less concepts that get produced under this local area unemployment statistics program than is produced during the current population survey. But I will try and highlight when the source is different. So when we look at the Laos data, this is what our labor forces look like for the last 23 years. And in a big room, if we were presenting, I'd say, just look at this graph. Like, it just leaves me in awe every time I look at it. And I try and get a laugh if I can. But this is really what our labor forces looks like, and it looks like tremendous stability. And so one of the tricks of the trade is if I always encourage people to watch out for non-zero axes. Like here, I've changed, it's the same data, but I've changed it to a non-zero axis where the base is now 320,000. And this is the exact same data, but you can see how much volatility and movement there's been from this, where it looks basically flat, 350,000 for 23 years, to this, where you see a lot more variation. And this aligns to your conversation this morning with JFO, where we say, look what's happened from the year 2000 to the year 2010. You have two things going on there. You have the aging of the baby boomers, where the leading edge of the baby boomers turned 65 in 2010. You have a massive economic downturn known as the Great Recession, where that pulls people into the labor force due to economic necessity. So if your household is feeling the pinch of an economic downturn, maybe a second earner goes into the labor force and starts looking for work. If you are thinking about retiring, you say, I'm not retiring during an economic downturn, I'm going to stay in the labor market. So you have this peak point, which is both demographically driven and an economic business cycle. So from 2010, 2011 forward, you see that downgrade. And it is way sharper than it should be. So I've filled in a little boat there to trick your eyes, because we have received better data. And this is kind of the funny part. Like in talking to Patrick this morning, our Joint Fiscal Office, when we're talking about these census data estimates, the U.S. Census Bureau does a great job of estimating Vermont population every 10 years as part of the national U.S. Census. In between those estimates have been up and down in terms of quality. We see, and this is what's happened here, is when we had population changes, all through 2010 to 2020, you could go to the bank with the idea that the Vermont population was 626,000 and change. For 10 years, it was basically 626,000 and change. Well, the 2020 census completes, and all of a sudden we have 17,000 more people than we anticipated, putting us in the 640 range. And then our statistical programs had to kind of respond, like, did these people just arrive in 2020, or did they kind of get here before? So I think Senator Clarkson asks about, when do we get this big data dump that we're going to kind of true up our data? And that'll be in March and April of this year. we've been given warning that the U.S. or our partners are going to fix this because they only had a 3-year fix for the labor force. So that 2017, 18, 19 is a fixed data, and the 2013 to 2016 hasn't been fixed. So that's why I fill it in there. But if you look at 2010, the peak, you look at 2018, you see that downward trend. I think that's what it's going to look like. We have the COVID recession, and then 2023 kind of puts us back on that same trend line established in 2010 and 2018, and that is demographically driven. A lot of the stories that were initially focused on during COVID have kind of all worked their way through the system. So now what we see is demographic pressures associated with individuals leaving the labor force, and that is a big part of it. I'll just pause there before I go into sub-state data. Okay. All right. So we can produce through our Bureau of Labor Statistics program. We do estimate down to even the town level. So if you wanted to know the labor force of your local town or the unemployment rate, that is produced through this partnership. Here I just focus on a county level information. And again, kind of talking about this idea of population. We've had tremendous population growth, but it's not all bearing out in our labor force, right? So I showed you that graph that basically looked flat for our labor force, yet our population has grown about 20 to 25,000 people. So they are not people that are necessarily joining the labor force. They could either be under 16 or have retired over the age of 65 or something. And I think Joint Fiscal Office addressed that more thoroughly than I'm going to today because I knew you were speaking to him. But when you look at, if you create a visual map in your mind of where labor force contraction has been, what jumps out to me is the 4 southern counties. Bennington down 12% since its peak. Rutland down 16%, Windham down 15%, Windsor down 11%. So those 4 counties down south, they had peak labor force in like 2006, 2007, and since then have contracted significantly. The only places that are showing growth or are like currently at all-time highs are Franklin and Chittenden County. So those are at labor force highs basically. And the last column is just basically the change since 2020, the COVID. For a while, not all counties had even gotten back to where they were, from the COVID recession. Rutland is the last one over the line. It's at 0% growth. That translates to 11 people more in the labor force in Rutland currently in 2023 than 2020 during the economic downturn. So you can see that, the Northeast Kingdom is following those similar trends as the South in some ways, where Caledonia has double-digit declines, as it is Essex. Number of unemployed persons. Here is the number of unemployed people in the state of Vermont. These are individuals, these are residents, as estimated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this is separate than who's collecting unemployment insurance benefits. We'll look at a slide like that later. This is the statistical concept of who's unemployed, who's actively looking for work, who can accept work if offered, but they've looked for work in the last 4 weeks. And as I mentioned, back in 2011, that was considered a massive recession with over 20,000 unemployed Vermonters. You have that progression where the economy improves to 2020, and then you get the huge spike associated with COVID. But since COVID, the number of unemployed people is back down to that 2018, 2019 level. And I think, from a lot of the data I'm looking at, conversations I'm having, there's a lot of similarities in this current economy to that 2018, 2019 level. Where the economy continues to grow, but it's growing at a slower rate. And so kind of the big question is what's next? Is there going to be a big push in a positive direction, big push in a negative direction? Or are we just going to continue to keep this kind of slower trajectory of growth going? But that is our unemployed population, about 8,500.
Yeah, thank you. Matt, Keisha has a question.
Matt, maybe you're getting to it, but I was hoping that the demographics would.
Yes.
There it is at the end.
Yes. You want to jump to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to note for people who weren't on the committee, through the pandemic, JFO wanted to highlight that we had a pretty large rate of unemployed women who might have been leaving service jobs, that et cetera. But there was some disagreement on the numbers, and I just want to make sure that there was one issue where some of the reporting didn't have gender, so it couldn't be mixed in with the reporting that did have gender. So are we like all collecting demographics the same way now?
That is a good question, and that's one I'd want to ask my counterparts in the Unemployment Insurance Division. I know they are in the middle of a system modification or rebuild, and I know that is a priority of the new system. I'm not sure where we are at with the current system, though.
Yeah, I recall that we had a big challenge on that, and that particularly with Remote Works for Women and their reports, that there was so much that wasn't collected by gender. And hard to get. So thanks, Matt. Let's
No
keep
problem.
going.
So those are the number of unemployed Vermonters. I'm just going to whip through the other programs of note. We do collect occupational safety and health statistics, both in the form of occupational injury and illness in the workplace, injuries and illnesses, but also fatalities in the workplace. We do industry and occupational projections. This is not a Bureau of Labor Statistics funded effort. It's through the Employment and Training Administration. We do annually 2-year projections of both industry and occupations. And then every other year, we do 10-year projections, and that's highlighted in the brochure that we already discussed. Lastly, though there is not a state role in this, the Job Openings Layoffs Turnover Survey, JOLTS, is a Bureau of Labor Statistics product that does provide us useful information about the state of Vermont, most notably job openings. And so this is from 2011 to current, the number of job openings in the state of Vermont. And you can see what a recession looks like, where, 2011, demand for labor starts increasing. We get to 2018-19. The COVID recession certainly put a big wrinkle in it. We had, for the first time ever, over 20,000 job openings estimated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that was for a period of 2.5 years. But to my earlier point, how things right now look more like 2018, 2019 in a lot of the data, you can see how the demand for labor in the form of job openings has come down. And we're now at 15,000 job openings, and that is more in line with pre-pandemic levels. So the demand for labor is still elevated. We considered 2018 and 2019 tight labor market conditions. Employers were talking about having difficulty hiring, but it is not as bad as it was 2011, 2020, or 2021, 2022. So one thing I like.
But Matt, it's still almost 2 to 1 in terms of people unemployed and job openings. So for every person who's unemployed, not that they're all equally able, but it's sort of 2 to 1 still, isn't it?
100%. And that's right where I'm going, that if we take this, it provides for a simple calculation, and the senator's 100% right. It's not a perfect metric, because you could live in Newport and the job's in Bennington, or you want to work in healthcare and the job's in construction. But you can divide these numbers to get a ratio. I like job openings to unemployed persons. Some people like it the other way, but I like that 2 to 1 concept that you mentioned. That's the green section, where there's more than 2 jobs for every 1 unemployed person. Versus, during economic downturns, you have more people looking for work than there are jobs available. That's that red section. And you can see just now, only recently, based on the most recent information, we dropped below that 2 to 1 ratio. We're still elevated, but we are below 2 to 1 now for the first time in a while.
Yeah.
All right. UI data, I'll just go through this quickly. We do weekly.
Sorry, Matt,
Yeah.
I just go back to that challenge that we face. If you take out, and I don't know if the data would enable you to do this, but if you took out those in that 8,000 or 8,500 number of the unemployed number, if you took out those that are that are ineligible or unable, or what would it be? Do we have any data on how many are actually ready to go back to work? And it's because I know there are a lot of different players in that 8,500.
Great question. And actually that 8,500 should be the I'm ready to get back to work population. These are people that have looked for work in the last month. They say they're able and willing to accept work if offered. We do, through our partnership with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, produce what's called alternative measures of labor underutilization. For the techies out there, you'll be excited to learn that the quote unquote official unemployment rate is really called the U3. And there are 6 measures in there, the U1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what the senator is pointing to and teeing up for me is that as you get further out, the U4, U5, U6, you start adding in, first off, the first person at the U4, you're adding in discouraged workers, people who have given up looking for work. Last estimate of number of discouraged workers in the state of Vermont was 400. It's an extremely low number based on historical trends. And one of the reasons we think is that the department, in partnership with all our partners and all the business community, is getting the word out there that there are jobs. And so from a discouraged worker standpoint, saying, I don't believe there's any jobs out there for me is not the case. You can add in, though, the marginally attached when you get to the U5. These are people who say they want work, but they can't accept work if offered. This is where you start adding in concepts of, I don't have reliable transportation. I have childcare issues. I have to take care of a sick parent. So they want work, but they can't accept it. So that's the marginally attached. You're adding in about another 2,000 people. And then the last group to get all the way to the U6, just to round out the conversation, the U6 population includes people who want full-time work, but can only find part-time work. So they want to work more hours. And when you include those, the 400 discouraged workers, the about 1,000 to 2,000 marginally attached workers, and then another 5,000 or so people who want more hours, you actually double the population. So from 8,500, you're getting to 17,000 people who are what I call not in a good economic situation based on their stated preferences. So that takes you to 17,000. Senator Sanders is if you hear him speak about the quote unquote real unemployment rate, a lot of times what he's referring to is the U6.
Yeah, got it. Thanks. And then those permanently of working age that are disabled and incapable of working, that's another whole area of other number.
Correct. They are outside the labor force completely. And we track those people in terms of, we do have some very basic top line information from the current population survey about why you're not in the labor force. And some will say retired, or some will say other. And I'd have to dig deeper into that, though, if we wanted to look at who's not in the labor force. But I will point out that our labor force Yes?
No, I just would be curious as to that number.
Yeah, sure. The one thing when we've gone down this road, and it's always interesting because what it does is it reminds us that our labor force participation rate in Vermont is higher than the nation overall by about 3 points. So I think the nation is 63.5 and we are 66.5. And so we do have a high labor force participation rate. And our unemployment rate, and this is how we've been able to get through, hide this idea that we're having a declining labor force, is we have such a low unemployment rate. We are tied for second lowest in the country at 2.4% unemployed. So the people who are looking to work are being more successful finding work than in other states. And our high labor force participation rate gives us that added bump in terms of helping with our tight labor market conditions.
And just remind us who's lower than we are. South Dakota?
Yes, 100% correct. And we're tied with North Dakota.
Yeah, Keisha's got a question.
There were 2 figures, Matt, that I'm hoping we can get at some point. I don't know if it's just Kevin Chu, who's the one who keeps track of how many job listings we have versus how many home listings that we have. That's always been a useful thing to understand. It was like 24,000 versus 1,000 a couple of years ago.
And he'll be in early February. He wasn't available.
Yeah, I mean, and his, I don't know if you keep data that you think is somehow more accurate on that front end. The other one being testing a hypothesis that perhaps people who had not been participating in the workforce, who were able to access more affordable childcare, may have gotten into the workforce. So, if there's some way you can help us see test that hypothesis, that'd be helpful.
Yes, I'd be happy to, Senator. To your first point, to my knowledge, Kevin Chu's really data-driven and does look to a lot of the same federal sources that we've spoken on today. So that 24,000 number of job openings, I think, is probably in that red box right when we used to be up there in those 20,000s. I know he references this data set. I'm not familiar with the housing data you mentioned, but yeah, from my experience, he's normally pretty good about using credible sources.
Great.
But yes, to your other point, though, about the who's out of the labor force is always a good one. And the reasons, we always wish we had more information about the why. Why aren't people in the labor force? And unfortunately, a lot of our federal surveys are quite thin when you start getting down into those questions of why.
Has the Department of Labor, to go to Randy's, because I think we talked about this earlier with Patrick about doing sort of more individual follow-up. Is there any way the Department of Labor could engage a UVM class or a group of people who could go out and survey those who are still to try and get at some of that, to do a sample survey of those barriers
of people?
Or yeah, exactly.
The Department of Labor would always be looking forward to partnering. I think our bread and butter is certainly employer surveys because we know how to reach those people. We would need a partner that could reach individual Vermonters. And I do know like the UVM Center on Rural Studies does do the Vermonter poll, and they're a great avenue for trying to get a sample of Vermonters to answer questions. And we have used them in the past when there was a topic of interest. But yes, definitely Michael Mosier at the UVM Data Center is a great partner in that regard.
Hourly,
Yeah.
talk about hourly with political science program too is always happy to talk about legislative interest for doing work with students.
Yeah, and there's also, to my knowledge, in the fall, they have a legislative research class that you could potentially enlist in doing research.
James, just introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm James Rogers, intern for Representative Trevor
And
Campbell.
UVM?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Matt, why don't you continue?
Okay. I'll just highlight, and this is a conversation for a later time, the unemployment insurance. Again, we're still kind of in this overview of what our division does, but also kind of taking side stories into what the data says. Unemployment insurance reporting, we do a lot of that for our UI coworker or partners. We do weekly, monthly, semi-annual reports. This includes the weekly update on the trust fund, and there'll be a more comprehensive report coming your way by the end of the month. Current trust fund balance is over $300 million, which puts us in a good spot from the overall health of the fund, and the direction it's heading is positive. So
Can you just, I've got a question from Tom, but can you just remind us where we landed in terms of our understanding of when it was full? Was it 500 million, or was it, when was enough for us to be able to really significantly rein in rates?
That is a good policy question. If you don't mind, I would defer until we do the full report to have better understanding of what the 2023 data looks like.
Okay.
The reason that it's not a standard answer is that when wage growth is growing, or when wages are growing, that means the liabilities of associated benefits in the event of an economic downturn are also growing. And as we mentioned earlier, wages have been growing at a higher rate. So those have a trickle-down effect in terms of higher benefits. And so I just want to make sure, based on the 2023 data that's yet to be finalized, 2024 data that's yet to be finalized, what an updated number would be. I've heard numbers like, I've heard anywhere from 300 million to 350. So it's really to person's preference and taste. We are currently at the lowest tax rate schedule right now. And we are accruing about $15 million a year in the trust fund. So I would just want to kind of sensitivity test the current levels against what a modest economic downturn would be, or an aggressive economic downturn, because as we've seen in the past, the trust fund can be depleted quite quickly in the event of a bad economic downturn.
Yes, and for those of you who worked with us during the downturn, the health of our trust fund really it saved us. I mean,
Yes.
it was So keeping a healthy trust fund has benefits when we hit those moments.
I was just gonna
Yeah.
offer a comment that on the dashboard of Vermont, I like that there's on a blinking red light in the UI trust fund. So I just want
Yeah.
to recognize that it's doing great, doing fine, and that's great to all your good work there as opposed to education, financing, healthcare, childcare, and everything else. So
Can I
Right.
ask one more quick?
Yeah.
I recall that some of the self-insured organizations all of a sudden felt a bit of a crisis in not having unemployment dollars available. Do you think more entities have joined our UI system since that time so that they didn't have the same issue again?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a little tough to figure out because there was changes to the coverage laws in unemployment insurance recently where nonprofit organizations were required to join. So as of July of last year, all nonprofits, as my understanding, are required to join this system. And so we did get a surge in registration associated with nonprofits. I actually presented at the annual nonprofit conference and talked a little bit about this, where people are now joining and what they could expect now that they were within this system, not only just quarterly filings and quarterly taxes and contributions due, but the downstream effects of being part of the Department of Labor's employer database.
That's the great news. Very much nonprofits who were coming to us and saying, help us, because we were self-insured.
Right. No, that.
Right.
Okay, why don't you keep going?
Okay, and we're almost towards the end here. And this is a highlight of the unemployment insurance claims. It does not include 2020 and 2021 data because those are off the chart. And the point of this is to highlight just kind of how similar we are to 2018, 2019 levels. You can see this is every week in a year, and there's 5 years of data here. How seasonal our Vermont economy is and how much it follows very much a predictable path for the most part. But, since 2022, 2023, 2024, our levels are even lower than where they were in 2018 or 2019. So that idea that if everyone just got off of unemployment insurance benefits and took a job, we'd be all set. There's just not enough people on here. There's about 3,000, 4,000 people, depending on the time of year, that are collecting unemployment insurance. So it is much smaller than the full universe of unemployed people.
on this chart, the
Yes.
week one, July 1 or January 1?
This is January 1. Yep. So the winter months is our busiest season.
It seems to contrast with the previous slide where I thought our employment goes up in the winter time and the ski resorts put people to work.
They do, but construction has layoffs. And so what happens is the construction is a greater force in that seasonal factor. They're much more accustomed to working their usual construction schedule in season and then filing for unemployment insurance benefits as soon as the season ends with an understanding of return to work in the spring.
Thank you.
Yeah, but we also had a very common trend of people moving from construction to outdoor rec in the winter. So that has that is there? I would think we'd want to be encouraging that, and so that people wouldn't be going on unemployment, but going to well-paid work in outdoor rec seasonally.
Yeah, I would leave that to the commissioner's office or our policy people to have that deeper conversation with you about what would be best in those outcomes. I do know there has been some reluctance, for either individuals or employers on those conversations. So I'm not sure where it's landed or what the current thought is, but I haven't seen anything meaningfully change as evidenced by this data. It's pretty clockwork.
Thanks.
All right. So lastly, and I know Senator Rahm Hinsdale, this is where you wanted to probably begin. So, as I mentioned, the Local Area Unemployment Statistics Program, in partnership with the U.S. Census Bureau, uses current population survey data. This is not BLS data. This is not something my team produces, but it is something available to us through the U.S. Census Bureau and the current population survey. And I've just grabbed some highlights of this. And unfortunately, due to sample size, I think last time I checked, the sample size is maybe like 1,200 households in the state of Vermont that's generating this information.
And Sorry, Matt, how does this population survey sync with what we just got with Patrick? Are you two? I mean, and what's the date of the most? What is this current to what date?
I realized that after. Excellent question, Senator. This is not dated. It is November of 2024.
Okay, great.
So this is November of 2024. And, in theory, if we had a robust sample and a ton of data underlying these metrics, we could look at crosstabs of like not only just women, but women 25 to 54. Well, that population might not be bad. But as soon as you start adding multiple factors in this, where we start saying not only age, but sex or race and ethnicity, the data gets even jumpier, like really volatile to the point it's not credible in a conversation. So for example, like race and ethnicity tends to be the jumpiest as it relates to the non-white categories, which is a census term. So individuals that identify as Black and Hispanic both currently do have labor force participation rates higher than white. Historically, looking at the last 10 years, I've seen the labor force participation rates for individuals to identify as Black, vary from 60 to 80%. It can just be really, really jumpy. So I try and use long arcs, moving averages to kind of give the data some stability. Because as I put down in this, the little asterisks here, this is the most volatile category because of the size of the groups. There's estimated to be 510,000 people that are identified as white. There's 8,000 people who identify as Black and 11,000 that identify as Hispanic. And as I mentioned, if you're talking about 1,200 households, how many people in those households identify as these characteristics? Did you really get a good sample to, produce data for those 8,000 people or 11,000 Vermonters that identify as Hispanic? So just some interesting information. And I would also point out that the Black labor force participation rate is higher than the white labor force participation rate as the nation as well. And how this dovetails into your earlier conversation is it's a good chance it's demographically driven. White people are older. Our population that is aging tends to be older. A lot of their younger Vermonters have a higher mix of different races and ethnicity than just the quote unquote white alone category that the US Census Bureau identifies. So younger Vermonters have a more rich diversity as it relates to race and ethnicity. And so being younger, earlier in their working career, they are going to have a higher labor force participation rate. As you can see, as evidenced by the age category, where as soon as you get to that 65 and older category, the labor force participation rate drops all the way down to 26%. So that is a big part of what I wanted to say today. So, woo, this is for you.
David and then Tasha. Go.
Go, please.
Matt, I can't remember if it was you, but to your point, and something I'd like to see updated is someone, and maybe it was Kevin Chu, so maybe he's going to clean up for you, but it was, 3% of seniors were identified as, I think it was 3% of seniors identified as a person of color, 10% of school-age kids identified as a person of color. So it was starting to become quite a stark difference. And that was a few years ago, we looked at that figure. You go, David, because I missed
So I've got two questions. First, thank you, Matt. So the briefing is excellent. And this coupled with the previous briefing is very helpful. But what I haven't heard is a state type GDP statistic. And I'm wondering why that's not in the briefing and if that's forthcoming in another briefing.
That's a good question. I think that we would turn to Joan and our ACCD partners for that, I think.
I had a related question, which is, Matt, usually you give us more wage information, like wages by county. I think you were the first person to point out who was back up pre-recession levels income-wise. Now are there new trends about, whose incomes have recovered from other major economic events? We just always want more data.
Well, I'm happy to do my best to provide that. Certainly, GDP is something that I could present on. It's not something I focus on in my role at the Department of Labor, just because there's so much other data that comes across our shop that is produced by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA. We do have a publication where we will highlight Vermont GDP data. And so if that is something that the committee wants to hear from, certainly the Department of Labor can do that. Or as Senator Clarkson said, Agency of Commerce and Community Development may weigh in. I don't know who would prefer to have quote unquote jurisdiction. We don't, to my knowledge, we don't have any state partners to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So it's kind of up for grabs.
If we're able to provide it, I think we'd be very interested in it.
Okay.
And we'll ask Joe. Let's chat about that. But I think
Okay.
if you get it, we'd love it.
Thank you, Matt. Second question is, you had a slide on the largest private sector employment
Right.
statistic data, but it was a snapshot in time, and I'm wondering why you didn't use the 20-year or 25-year trend graphics approach that you use on many of the other slides, and I'm wondering if that's available. Again, the largest private sector employment as a trend, as opposed to a snapshot in time. Like,
Sure.
so for example, a manufacturing number just stands out, and I'm wondering if, there's nothing here to help me understand, is it stagnant? Is it decreasing? Is it increasing? That's very helpful.
And how it compares to what you talked about with the durable goods manufacturing going down.
Yep, fair point. I do have those data and could present them at any time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. If those two follow-ups would be great, in case you did remember.
It was wages. It was like a much deeper dive on wages, which maybe we'll do when we do wage growth policy.
Right, because I think wage growth is certainly something we need to look at.
And I was looking at this, and I hope people can appreciate that. If you are trying to meet the basic needs budget, you need two people in your household sharing income in most of these jobs to survive.
So it's only responsible for us to look at the other side of the cost equation, which is how much we're earning. So that's why wage growth is an essential piece of what we need to be addressing this year, because we can only affect inflation and the economy of the state, the world, the nation so much, and but we can affect in some measure our wages.
Right. It's certainly balanced so we don't lose inflation too.
Absolutely.
Similarly, and I'm assuming this is going to come in other presentations and that it's good for the course, but I'd love to see the breakdown of our unemployment or our positions open relative to the service sectors. So I'd like to know if it's more healthcare versus service versus the trades, if there is misalignment in what our job seekers are looking for with what our
So you mean jobs that are open? Could we get that, Matt? The jobs opening and what sector the jobs are open in? And I don't know how you'd know of the UI people who was skilled in X area that isn't working in that area, but that's I think a harder thing to identify.
Yeah, the center has identified two really good questions and good information to have if it was available. That JOLTS data source that I shared earlier that gives us the 15,000 estimated job openings in the state of Vermont is a top line number only. It does not go into industry. I have, as an exercise, done some calculations into what it would look like. The challenge and why it's never really been produced or published, from the Department of Labor, is that when we try and get industry partners to look at it, it doesn't pass the credibility test with them because of the seasonality. So, I could kind of give a general estimate of what, kind of like the statistical estimate would be, but because from month to month to month, certain industries are ramping up or ramping down, we've had problems, people, kind of signing off on it outside of the data people. So that is a good question and something I could certainly pull together what I've done in the past to share, to talk about. And it would just be under the assumption that it's for information purposes only, best estimate, and any given week or month it could fluctuate. For Job seekers, we do have some information about what they're looking for, and we can pull that together through our workforce development division. All people with a registered through the workforce development division do have some sort of criteria, and it does become a challenge there just because of transferable skills. Like, and I use that example of healthcare and construction. Like someone saying, I want a job in construction. And I say, oh, have you considered working for the local hospital? They say, no, did you hear me? I said, I want to work in construction. I said, well, the hospital's huge and they need lots of support as it relates to the building, the mechanics, and all these things, and trying to get people to understand how their skills transfer outside their normal area of focus and expertise.
We have one more question.
Please.
It would be really relevant to have that information, because our job, our skill creating,
Our workforce
our
development.
workforce development, if it's not matched, then if we've got a disconnect, then we need to pull.
Oh, absolutely. And so I would think that, Matt, as much as you could coordinate with Jay Ramsey, he has a ton of information about the jobs that are open, because we're always trying to make that match between what we're training people for and the jobs that are available. And so he actually, and maybe when we ask you back, you and Jay could present a bit on that.
Certainly.
And I think he could fill in, of your 15,000 jobs that are open, he might be able to help identify some of what that may be. Yeah, maybe.
Great.
Any other questions before we break? Matt, thank you. This was terrific. And Heidi, you've met Heidi a little bit, our wonderful committee. We'll be in touch about the follow-up on everything from GDP to job seekers and job openings.
I appreciate that, Senator. And Heidi knows how to find Rowan, who's always the best person to contact for Department of Labor, and we'll make sure we delve